You don't expect the sentence, "I'd like to be infected with worms, please," to come from someone who is otherwise completely sane. But there she was, mid-30s, ulcerative colitis so aggressive her colon was, medically speaking, staging a rebellion. She'd tried steroids, she'd tried immunosuppressants that cost more per month than my car, and she looked me dead in the eye and said she'd read about a treatment involving hookworms and she wanted in. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I did not laugh. I wanted to laugh. Every cell in my medical training screamed, "This is a joke. This is WebMD written by a raccoon." But I didn't laugh because she was right. Somewhere in the last few decades, a small, strange, deeply underfunded corner of immunology figured out that giving people parasitic worms on purpose, under supervision, in carefully measured doses, can calm down diseases where the immune system has lost its mind. This isn't folk medicine. This isn't a Facebook group cure. This is published, peer-reviewed, clinical trial, please put this in a journal, science. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why intentionally infecting a human being with a parasite can, in specific and narrow circumstances, be a rational medical decision, and why your immune system is frankly kind of an idiot that occasionally needs a babysitter. Let's build a character profile. Your immune system is not one thing. It's an entire government made of competing departments who barely speak to each other, all reacting to the same threat with wildly different opinions about the correct response. There's a division built for bacteria, there's a division built for viruses, and, this is the one we care about, there's a division built specifically for parasites. Scientists call it the Th2 response, T helper 2, and its entire evolutionary purpose is dealing with worms. For most of human history, worms were not an occasional inconvenience. They were background noise. Practically everyone had them. Your ancestors were, statistically, walking apartment complexes for intestinal parasites, and the Th2 system evolved as full-time property management. Here's the part that should bother you a little. Your immune system was built assuming it would spend a large percentage of its working life negotiating with parasites. It expects tenants. It has policies in place for tenants. And for the last 100 years or so, a blink, evolutionarily speaking, we evicted all the tenants with sanitation, clean water, and modern medicine. The immune system did not get the memo. It's still staffed for a war that mostly isn't happening anymore. And an immune system with nothing to fight doesn't retire peacefully. It gets bored. And a bored immune system starts looking for enemies closer to home. Pollen, gluten, your own intestinal lining, the sheath around your own nerves. That's not folklore. That's the leading explanation for why allergic and autoimmune diseases have exploded in wealthy, sanitized countries over the last century, while staying comparatively rare in regions with high rates of parasitic infection. It's called the Hygiene Hypothesis, and it has an update most people haven't heard, the Old Friends Hypothesis, which argues it's not dirt in general your immune system misses, it's specifically the organisms, worms included, that co-evolved with us for hundreds of thousands of years. We didn't just lose the parasites, we lost the referees. So here's where it gets genuinely beautiful, and I want you to sit with that word for a second, because I know it's a strange one to apply to intestinal parasites. A worm living in you has exactly one job from an evolutionary standpoint. Don't die, and don't let the host die either, because a dead host is an unemployed worm. Killing you is bad business. So over millions of years, parasitic worms evolved an extraordinary skill set for one specific purpose, turning down your immune response so it doesn't destroy them. They do this through secreted molecules, proteins the worm releases in your gut that talk directly to your immune cells. Some of these molecules mimic your own regulatory signals. Some recruit a specific class of cell called a regulatory T cell, or Treg, whose entire job is to tell the rest of the immune system, stand down. We're not at war. Put the weapons away. Think of your immune system as airport security. Normally, efficient security is supposed to be calm, selective, checking real threats, and waving through your grandmother's knitting needles without incident. An autoimmune disease is what happens when airport security starts strip-searching the knitting needles, then the luggage, then the walls, then eventually itself. A worm remarkably acts like a very calm supervisor walking the security line saying, "Everybody relax, I've got this handled. Put your training suspicion of literally everything on pause." Not because it cares about you, because a riot at airport security is bad for a parasite trying to catch a connecting flight through your intestines for the next several years. The Treg cells the worm recruits don't just dial down immune activity system-wide, they dial down immune activity system-wide. That's the mechanism researchers are trying to hijack. Not the worm exactly, but the ceasefire it negotiates. Known, helminths induce regulatory T cells and shift immune activity away from inflammatory patterns seen in inflammatory bowel disease. Strong evidence, this effect measurably reduces symptoms in specific conditions, particularly inflammatory bowel disease. Hypothesis, still being tested, the exact molecular signals responsible and whether they can be isolated into a drug without the worm attached. Unknown, why it works dramatically well in some patients and does almost nothing in others.
Fast fact: the organism most commonly used in modern trials isn't even a human parasite. It's Trichuris suis, the pig whipworm. It can survive briefly in the human gut, trigger the immune calming effect, and then, this is the elegant part, it can't actually establish a long-term colony in a human host. It visits, it negotiates, it leaves. No permanent worm roommate required. In the early 2000s, a gastroenterologist named Joel Weinstock ran a small trial giving Trichuris suis eggs dissolved in a drinkable solution to patients with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis who hadn't responded well to standard treatment. The results weren't a miracle cure. Medicine almost never hands you one of those. But a meaningful percentage of patients with severe treatment-resistant disease went into remission. Not felt a bit better, remission. The kind of outcome gastroenterologists don't expect from patients who've already failed multiple drug classes. Follow-up studies since then have been mixed. Some replicate the effect strongly, some show more modest results, and a couple of larger trials underwhelmed compared to the early excitement. That's normal. That's what actual science looks like before a treatment matures. Not a straight line of triumph, but a messy, argumentative back and forth between labs trying to figure out exactly who benefits, at what dose, and why. What hasn't been disputed is the underlying biology. Helminths measurably change immune activity in humans in the direction autoimmune patients need. The debate isn't whether the ceasefire is real, it's how reliably you can call it in. Myth 1. True or false? Doctors are handing out worms like vitamins now. Wildly false. Helminthic therapy remains experimental, is not FDA approved as a standard treatment in most countries, and legitimate research is conducted under strict clinical protocols with carefully controlled dosing, specific organisms selected for their inability to cause serious disease, and patients who've usually exhausted conventional options. This is not eat dirt and see what happens. People have tried to sell exactly that online, and it is dangerous, unregulated, and not what actual physicians running trials are doing. From the immune system's perspective, here's the internal monologue during Helminthic therapy, dramatized slightly for effect. Something foreign has entered. Deploy inflammatory response. Wait, this foreign thing is releasing calming signals I recognize from deep evolutionary memory. This isn't a virus. This isn't bacteria. This is old friend category. Stand down partial deployment. Redirect resources. Recruit regulatory cells. Begin ceasefire protocol across all fronts, not just the gut. Why was I attacking the colon lining again? I don't actually remember. Ceasefire there too, I suppose. It's not that the immune system becomes weak. That's the myth people worry about most, and it's worth addressing directly. Patients on this therapy aren't rendered defenseless against real infections. It's more like an overcorrected thermostat getting nudged back toward a setting it hasn't used in decades, but still technically remembers. Here's where I have to be the responsible doctor in the room for a second, because I can already feel some of you mentally adding acquire worms to your health optimization spreadsheet. Helminthic therapy shows its strongest, most consistent results in diseases where the problem is an overactive immune response attacking tissue that shouldn't be under attack, inflammatory bowel disease, some allergic conditions, and there's ongoing interest in multiple sclerosis and certain autoimmune skin conditions. It is not a universal immune reset button. Diseases driven by different mechanisms don't necessarily respond the same way, and in a patient who's actually immunocompromised for other reasons, deliberately adding a parasitic infection is not a clever biohack. It's a genuinely bad idea that could go seriously wrong. This only works because it's happening in a specific patient population at a controlled dose with a specific organism selected precisely because it's a poor long-term colonizer of humans. Context isn't a footnote here. Context is the entire treatment. Fast fact, regions with historically high rates of intestinal parasites show dramatically lower rates of multiple sclerosis, asthma, and inflammatory bowel disease, a pattern epidemiologists noticed decades before anyone tried testing it directly with a clinical trial. The geography told the story before the biochemistry could explain it. Here's the part of medicine that keeps me up at night in the good way, not the malpractice insurance way. For the entirety of modern medical history, our instinct with parasites has been unanimous: identify, treat, eliminate. Deworming programs are one of public health's genuine triumphs, and they should absolutely continue. Untreated heavy parasitic infection in vulnerable populations, especially children, causes real and serious harm: malnutrition, anemia, impaired development.
And yet, in this narrow, specific corner of immunology, we've discovered a population of patients who are, in a sense, suffering from an absence. Patients whose immune systems are misfiring specifically because they never got the calming input those systems evolved to expect. Both things are true at once. Parasites can devastate a malnourished child in a region without treatment access, and a carefully dosed, medically supervised parasite exposure can be genuinely therapeutic for a specific autoimmune patient in a controlled setting. Medicine rarely deals in universal villains. It mostly deals with dosage, context, and which specific problem you're actually trying to solve. Beyond Trichuris suis, researchers have also studied hookworm, yes, an actual human hookworm, Necator americanus, in small controlled trials for conditions like celiac disease and asthma. Some participants tolerated controlled hookworm exposure well and showed measurable immune changes. Larger confirmatory trials are still needed before anyone calls this an established treatment. Researchers are also working on something arguably more elegant than the worm itself: isolating the specific immune-modulating molecules the worms secrete, purifying them, and turning them into a drug. All of the calming signal, none of the actual organism. If that research succeeds, we may eventually get the ceasefire without ever needing to recruit the diplomat. Back to my patient, the one who asked for worms with the calm confidence of someone ordering a coffee. She wasn't enrolled in the therapy that day. That decision involves a specialist, a controlled trial or compassionate use protocol, careful screening, and monitoring most people don't picture when they hear, "Here, have some parasites." But I'll tell you what struck me about the conversation. She wasn't desperate or irrational. She'd read the Immunology. She understood the mechanism better than some of the residents I've worked with. She'd simply arrived, from a different angle, at the same conclusion evolutionary biologists reached decades ago. Our immune systems were built in negotiation with these organisms, and removing them entirely, all at once, on a civilizational scale, was never going to be a completely clean break. We got the sanitation, we got the reduced mortality from parasitic disease. Those are real, enormous public health wins, and nobody serious is arguing otherwise. We also apparently got a slightly more trigger-happy immune system as an unplanned side effect, and a few very persistent, very patient immunologists spent their careers asking whether some of that could be renegotiated on our terms, at a dose we control, with an organism we choose, in patients we monitor. If you're living with an autoimmune or inflammatory condition and this video has you eyeing the nearest lake with new intentions, please don't. Uncontrolled, unsupervised exposure to actual wild parasites carries real risks: unpredictable dosing, unpredictable organisms, unpredictable damage, and none of the monitoring that makes the clinical version survivable and useful rather than dangerous. What you can actually do, if you have a treatment-resistant inflammatory or autoimmune condition and you're curious, ask your specialist whether there are active clinical trials in Helminthic therapy you might qualify for. This is real, ongoing research, not a rumor. Search terms like Helminthic therapy clinical trial alongside your specific condition will get you further than any forum post promising a miracle in a mason jar. And more broadly, the actual lesson here isn't go get worms, it's something a little bigger. Your immune system isn't a simple on-off switch you can just crank to maximum defense and call it a day. It's a negotiated equilibrium built over an evolutionary timescale most of us never think about, and it still remembers relationships we've collectively forgotten. Understanding that doesn't make disease less real, it makes the whole machine make a lot more sense, which, in my experience, is usually the thing that turns fear into something closer to fascination. The parasite was never trying to ruin your day. You were just, unfortunately, the only negotiating partner it had. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.